Meredith Holland fell asleep in coach, row 28, on the night train out of Providence at 7:40. 7 years of night shifts had taught her how to put her head down anywhere and be asleep in minutes, the only thing the profession had left her, after they took her nursing license, took her apartment, and took the good name it had cost her 7 years to build. In her inside pocket was $3,400. At her feet, a suitcase packed in a hurry. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew there was nothing left in Providence to stay for. She woke to the feeling of a hand against her cheek. Miss Holland, Meredith Holland, a man's voice. Low, unhurried, completely unfamiliar. The cabin lights had been dimmed. Beneath her was soft leather. Across her legs a wool blanket she was certain the railroad did not provide, and the air carried the scent of cedar. She was no longer in her own seat. The man sat across from her, hands resting on his knees, patient in the way of someone who had been sitting there a long while. He was no more than 35. Dark coat, a thin scar running along the left side of his jaw. Meredith sat up, her heart hammering. She had not given her name to a single person on this train. "Who are you?" she said. "Why am I here?" He answered neither question. He only glanced at his watch. "You bought your ticket at 7:13 this evening," he said. "This car was coupled to the train at 7:20. Meredith did the arithmetic. 7 minutes. "No one prepares a private railcar in 7 minutes, Miss Holland." He looked up, and for the first time, she met his eyes directly pale gray, calm, without a trace of the unease of a man doing something he shouldn't, "which means I knew you were going to run before you did." Her eyes went to the cabin door, closed. Beyond the window, the New England dark slid past without a single light in it. "We arrive at the station in 30 minutes, he continued, his tone as level as if he were discussing the weather. "The car is waiting. You'll be taken to my home in Newport. You'll have your own room. Everything you need is already there. You have no right to. And tomorrow," he said, "you're going to be my wife." The ceremony was arranged on Tuesday. Meredith laughed. One short, dry sound, the noise a person makes when the brain refuses what the ears have just delivered. "You've taken the wrong woman." "No." The man leaned forward, and for the first time, something surfaced faintly in his voice. Not hunger, not anger, but something that chilled her more than either would have. "I don't make that kind of mistake. You were kind to someone in my family, at a time when no one required you to be." Meredith stared at him. 7 years on the palliative floor, 423 people. She had held that many hands through their final hours, and she remembered nearly every face. But the face in front of her now, she had never seen before in her life. Some doors close in 7 minutes, and take a lifetime to open again. If Meredith's story has held you this far, leave a like and tell me in the comments what you think. Share it with someone you believe will understand, and subscribe so we can walk through the stories still ahead together. "Who?" Meredith said. "You just said I was kind to someone in your family." "Who?" The man didn't answer. He leaned toward the small table between them, poured water from a glass pitcher into a tumbler, and pushed it toward her, the movement so unhurried it made her want to scream. "My name is August Rain," he said. "You should drink some water. You haven't had anything since this afternoon." Meredith didn't touch the glass. She sat perfectly still, counting her breaths the way she'd taught hundreds of patients to count theirs, and searched her memory for a face that might match the one in front of her. There was none. "I don't know you." "No. Then you've got the wrong house, the wrong person, the wrong train." She heard her own voice rising and hated it. "I'm an unemployed nurse with $3,400 in my pocket. I don't have anything you could possibly want." August Rain watched her for a long moment. Then he said, in that same even voice, "Colin Vance." Meredith went rigid. "On March 20th, he filed a report concerning missing controlled medication from your unit. Your name was in that report. 3 weeks later, the board suspended your license pending investigation." He didn't look at a single piece of paper. He recited it from memory. "On April 11th, you went to the District 4 police station in Providence and reported what happened in the third-floor apartment on Wickenden Street. A file was opened, numbered, and closed 9 days later for lack of sufficient grounds. 2 ribs, right side. Inside the railcar, there was nothing left but the iron wheels striking the joints in the tracks. Meredith could hear the blood moving in her ears. 3 people knew what had happened on Wickenden Street. Her, Colin, and Nell Osgood, who'd sat with her in the emergency room that night and hadn't said a word to anyone for 4 months. 3 people. There was no 4th person in the world who knew whether it had been the right side or the left. "Where did you get that information?" she asked. Her voice had gone rough. "Do you really want to know? Where did you get it?" "You don't want to know," August said. "You want me to answer so you can keep telling yourself this is some kind of mistake. But it isn't, Miss Holland. And you've known that since the moment I said your name. Meredith shot to her feet. She moved faster than thought, driven by 7 years of instinct from hospital corridors at 3 o'clock in the morning, when a patient ripped out a breathing tube and you had to react before fear had time to arrive. She lunged for the railcar door. Her hand closed around the handle. The door didn't move. Then a hand closed around her wrist. No jerk. No twist. No pull. It simply closed, firm and certain, like a lock clicking properly into place. Meredith turned and found August Rain standing directly behind her, close enough for her to smell cedar, and she hadn't heard him leave his seat. "Let go of me. You're hurting yourself," he said. "Not me." He was right. She was fighting against his grip, and the pain shooting through her was in her own wrist, not in his hand. He didn't tighten his fingers even slightly. "I'll scream. Go ahead." He released her, stepped back, and somehow that frightened her more than being held. "This car isn't connected to any other car, Miss Holland. The conductor won't come through here. The trainmaster signed off on this car at 7:20, and he won't ask any more questions. Not tonight or any other night." Meredith leaned her back against the door. Her hand was trembling, and she clenched it into a fist to make it stop. "What are you going to do to me?" "I've already told you." "What are you going to do to my brother?" For the first time in 30 minutes, something changed in his face. Something very small, like the surface of still water being touched far away. "Nothing," August said. "Danny is fine." The way he said the boy's name sent cold down Meredith's spine, because he said it like the name of someone he knew. He returned to his seat, and when he spoke again, his voice had settled back into that same calm rhythm. "Miss Holland, last June your father died at home. 4 months later, the hospital transferred his outstanding debt to a collection company in Hartford. $61,000. You called them 14 times asking for an extension. The last call was in December." Meredith couldn't speak. 6 months ago, that debt was purchased from the collection company by a third party. All of it. You weren't notified because the buyer specifically requested that no notice be sent. She heard herself ask, very softly. 6 months ago. 6 months ago, August Rain said. 4 months before Colin Vance wrote that report. The train entered a curve. Light, from some distant house, swept across the window once, then vanished. And Meredith Holland stood there, pressed against a door that wouldn't open, understanding that this man had entered her life long before she'd even realized her life was beginning to fall apart. The train began to slow at 10:15, and Meredith knew it was slowing before she even looked outside, because the rhythm of the iron wheels had changed, a rhythm 7 years of riding the train to night shifts had engraved into her ears. She was still standing with her back against the door. She hadn't sat down once in the past 20 minutes, and August Rain hadn't asked her to. He simply folded the paper in front of him, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and said, "Kingston Station. We're getting off here." Meredith thought quickly. The station had employees. It had lights. There would be people waiting for trains at 10 o'clock at night. Security. Telephones. She'd passed through Kingston 40 times in her life, and she remembered the long platform, the low canopy, 2 rows of iron benches, and a ticket counter that closed after 8 o'clock. If she screamed there, someone would hear her. "You're calculating," August said. He wasn't looking at her at all. He was fastening the button on his coat. "I'm standing. You're calculating how many people are on the platform." He looked up. 7, Miss Holland. 3 getting off here, 2 boarding the train, 1 railroad employee, and 1 taxi driver sitting in his car in the north parking lot. I can tell you now, so you don't waste time counting. The railcar door opened with a dry hiss. Cold April air rushed in, carrying the smell of engine oil and damp earth. And Meredith drew a deep breath, because it was the first breath she'd taken in 30 minutes that didn't carry the scent of cedar. The platform stretched beneath yellow lights. It was emptier than she remembered. August stepped down first, then turned back and stood there with one hand extended toward her. He didn't hurry her. He simply waited, patient in the same way he'd waited inside the rail car while she'd still been asleep. Meredith looked past his shoulder. At the far end of the platform, beneath the last lamp, a man stood alone with his hands in the pockets of his coat. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't looking at a phone. He wasn't doing any of the things people normally did while waiting for someone. He simply stood there. His hair was cut short and had gone gray at the temples, and he carried himself like a man who had once worn a uniform and had never managed to lose the habit of standing perfectly straight. When Meredith stepped down from the last stair, the man looked at her. And he looked 1 second longer than necessary, just 1 second. But Meredith had spent 7 years reading the silences on other people's faces, reading the blink of a young man who had just heard a doctor say how many weeks were left, reading the way a wife turned her head because she didn't want to cry in front of her husband, And she knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't the look of a man seeing her for the first time. Then it was gone. The man's face became flat again, like a door closing. "Emmett," August said. "Boss, where's the car?" "South lot. I had it moved there at 9 o'clock. No one introduced anyone. Meredith stood between the two men on a platform with 7 people, and realized something she would think about many times in the weeks that followed, that she could absolutely scream right now. No one was covering her mouth. No one was holding her arms. The railroad employee was standing 40 paces away, and all she had to do was open her mouth. She drew in a breath. Then she looked at the 2 men waiting for her, and she understood that they knew she could scream too. They knew, and they weren't worried about it at all. And that absence of worry told her everything she needed to know about what would happen after the scream. "Miss Holland," August was still holding out his hand. "Walk beside me, or be carried. Either way, you're going home." He said it no louder than a greeting. Meredith looked at that hand, then toward the station exit, then down at her suitcase, which somehow was already in Emmett Doyle's hand. She walked. She didn't place her hand in his, and she would hold on to that tiny detail like a pebble in her pocket for many days afterward. But she walked, level with him, all the way down the platform, through the gate, and into the south parking lot, where a black car was already waiting with its engine running. And it wasn't until the car door closed behind her that Meredith Holland understood the first rule of the house she was being taken to. This man would always give her a choice. He would always ask. He would never force her. It was simply that both roads he laid out in front of her led to exactly the same place. The car drove for 40 minutes, and no one said a word. Meredith sat close to the door on the right, holding her handbag on her lap with both hands, and she counted the turns. She counted 19 before the road changed from pavement to gravel, and the crunch of stones beneath the tires went on longer than she'd expected, long enough for her to understand that this road belonged to one person, not to the town. The car stopped. Emmett opened the door for her, and she stepped out beneath a lamp hanging high overhead, hearing the sound of the sea somewhere behind the house, closer than she'd imagined. The great front door opened before anyone had a chance to knock. The woman standing in the doorway looked close to 60, her salt and pepper hair gathered into a low bun, her hands clasped in front of her in the manner of someone who had stood waiting at this threshold for decades and knew exactly where she was supposed to stand. She looked Meredith up and down once, quickly and neatly. Then she inclined her head. "Good evening, Mrs. Rain. Your room is ready." Meredith stood motionless in the entryway. "I'm not Mrs. Rain." The woman didn't blink. There wasn't a flicker of confusion, not a glance toward August for instruction, not the slightest sign that she'd just heard anything unusual. "I'm Bernadette Ross," she said. "I oversee this house. If you need anything during the night, there's a bell beside the bed." "I just told you I'm not. You've had a very long day," Bernadette said. "Please follow me." And she turned and walked away without waiting, without asking a second time. Because in this house no one asked twice. Meredith turned to look for August. He was no longer standing there. She hadn't heard him leave, just as she hadn't heard him rise from his seat on the train, and that silence was beginning to become the thing she feared most about this man. She followed Bernadette up the stairs, turned left, and walked the length of a long hallway, and the entire way she did exactly what 7 years in her profession had taught her to do in every unfamiliar building. She counted doors, 9 on the left, 7 on the right, a secondary staircase at the end of the hall. 2 turns. Bernadette opened the 8th door on the left and stepped aside. Meredith entered, and she didn't look at the room. She looked at the windows, 3 of them, all closed. She looked at the lock, a newly installed mortise lock. She looked out toward the balcony and saw that it projected over a stretch of darkness she guessed was the garden. And far below, very far below, there was the light of someone walking slowly along a set route. Then she turned and saw the book. It lay alone on the small table beside the bed, with nothing else beside it. Its blue cloth cover had faded. The spine was worn, and the lower right corner curled slightly upward from being opened and closed too many times. Meredith knew that book. She knew it the way people know a face in an old photograph, before they even managed to name it. Mrs. Behan, bed 8. For 6 straight weeks, every night shift, after the medication had taken effect and the woman still couldn't sleep, Meredith had pulled a chair close and read aloud to her, a few pages at a time, because Mrs. Behan said she didn't want to listen to the machines. The Country of the Pointed Firs, the same edition, the same faded blue cloth cover. Meredith picked it up. Her hands were cold. She opened it and flipped through the pages, and it fell open by itself to page 143, where a thin ribbon had already been placed, and she stood there for a very long time, staring at that page without being able to read a single word. That book belonged to the hospital. She had returned it herself to the bookshelf on the 4th floor the morning after Mrs. Behan died, at 7 o'clock, before taking off her white coat and walking home. "Mrs. Ross," she said, turning toward the door. The hallway was empty. The door had closed. And at that exact moment, very softly, very neatly, Meredith heard the lock turn once from the other side. Meredith set the book down and began doing what 7 years in her profession had taught her to do in every unfamiliar room. She walked the perimeter and counted 3 windows. She tried the first one, but the frame didn't move, and when she pressed her hand against the glass, she realized it was thicker than ordinary glass and had a thin film on the inside, the kind hospitals used in areas where agitated patients were kept. The balcony door was locked from the outside. She stood staring at that handle for a long time, then thought about breaking the glass, and then thought about who would reach this room first after the glass shattered, and she abandoned the idea. She checked the ceiling vent, about a handspan wide. She checked the bathroom door, no window. She checked the electrical outlets, the pipes, even the narrow gap beneath the main door, and when she'd completed the entire circuit, she sat down on the edge of the bed with both hands resting on her knees and realized that someone had already thought of every single thing she'd just thought of, long before she ever arrived. There was a knock at the door. The lock turned, and a young woman entered carrying a tray of food, about 23 years old, her dark hair tied neatly back, her footsteps almost soundless. "I'm Paloma," she said. "Mrs. Ross asked me to bring this up for you." She placed the tray on the table, turned the cup so the handle faced Meredith, and did it with the careful precision of someone who knew she was being watched. "I'm not a Mrs.," Meredith said. Paloma didn't answer. "Have you worked here long?" "Almost 2 years." "Then you know this house pretty well." "I know the parts where I work." Meredith stood slowly, keeping her distance. "Paloma, I only need to ask you one very small thing. Has anyone from this house ever been hospitalized?" "Someone in the family. An older woman." The girl was folding the napkin. Her hand stopped for exactly 1 beat, brief. No longer than the pause Meredith had seen hundreds of times on the faces of patients' families when they heard a question they'd already been warned not to answer. Then those hands finished folding the napkin. "The soup is still hot, ma'am. You should eat it while it's hot. You just stopped. I'll come back for the tray at 11 o'clock. Paloma." The girl had already reached the door. She turned back, and this time she looked directly at Meredith, and there was no fear in her eyes, which was what Meredith had been searching for, and no contempt either, but something closer to pity than anything else, and that made Meredith feel colder than anything in this room had managed to do. "Ma'am," Paloma said very softly, "people here don't ask. They wait to be told." Then she stepped outside, and the lock turned once again. Meredith didn't touch the food. She pulled her suitcase away from the foot of the bed, set it on the rug, and opened it. Everything was still there. The 3 shirts she'd folded in a hurry the night before were still folded in that same clumsy way. Her work shoes were wrapped in a plastic bag. The box of cold medicine she'd bought at the pharmacy on the corner of Wickenden Street. Her toothbrush. The notebook, where she'd written down her shifts, though she no longer needed it. She slipped her hand beneath the lining of the suitcase lid, into the place where the stitching had worn thin and only she knew about, where she kept the photograph of her father standing in front of the shop on Broad Street, the only photograph she still had after selling the apartment. She pulled it out. The photograph had been placed inside a new wooden frame. Meredith couldn't sleep, and by 4 o'clock in the morning she gave up, sitting with her back against the headboard, the photograph in its new wooden frame resting on her knees, and she did what she always did during every difficult shift. She arranged everything she knew in order. That man knew about Colin. He knew about the police report. He knew about her father's debt from 6 months earlier. He knew Danny. And inside this house there was a book that belonged on the 4th floor bookshelf of St. Brendan Hospital, a book Meredith herself had returned the morning after Mrs. Behan died. Mrs. Behan had no family. Not once during those 6 weeks had anyone come to visit her. Meredith remembered that clearly, because she'd thought about it so many times during the nights she'd sat beside bed 8. Paloma returned at 7 o'clock with a breakfast tray and found the previous night's tray untouched. She didn't say anything about it. "Did an older woman ever live in this house?" Meredith asked. Paloma set the tray down. "You should eat. I asked you a question." "You should eat," Paloma repeated, and then she straightened, clasping her hands in front of her, exactly the way Bernadette did. And Meredith realized this was the posture people in this house were taught to take when they had to say something difficult. "Ma'am, I'm going to tell you one thing, and I'm only going to say it once. No one here speaks about Mrs. Rain. No one. If you ask me, I'll answer the way I just did. If you ask Mrs. Ross, she'll leave the room." Who is Mrs. Rain? You heard what I said. She's his mother, isn't she? Paloma picked up the old tray and headed for the door. Was she his wife? Meredith called after her. He was already married, wasn't he? And now? The lock turned. Meredith stood in the middle of the room for a long time, her breath tight in her chest. Then she picked up the photograph and set it neatly on the bedside table beside the cloth-bound book. Two belongings that had once belonged somewhere else, now resting in a room that belonged to someone else, and she understood that she wasn't going to get anything more out of the girl. Bernadette Ross came upstairs at noon. She carried a stack of papers, which she placed on the table without explanation. Then went to check the fireplace, check the curtains, doing the things of someone who had been doing them for 40 years. Meredith leaned against the bathroom doorframe and chose her moment. Mrs. Ross. Yes, ma'am. That book on the table. Who put it there? Bernadette's hands continued smoothing the fold of the curtain. I had this room prepared on Monday. That's not an answer. That's the answer I have. Meredith took one step closer. Mrs. Ross. I read that book to someone. Every night for 6 weeks. She was admitted under the name Margaret Behan, and no one came to visit her even once. She heard her own voice break in the middle of the sentence and couldn't stop it. She died at 4:12 in the morning, and I was the only person there. Now I wake up in this house, and that book is sitting on my table. Tell me, who is Mrs. Rain? Bernadette Ross let the curtain fall from her fingers. She didn't turn around. She stood there with her back straight and her hands at her sides. And in the silence, Meredith could hear the sea clearly behind the house. Then the woman walked past her, went to the door, and closed it. Not a word, not a glance. Only the lock turning once, exactly as it always did. That evening, Paloma came up with the dinner tray, and this time Meredith didn't ask about Mrs. Rain. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hands resting in her lap and asked a different question, the one she'd been holding behind her teeth for 24 hours. Paloma, he's Mafia, isn't he? The girl was pouring water. She filled the glass, set down the pitcher, and turned the handle toward Meredith just as she'd done the night before. Then she looked up, watched Meredith for a moment, and said nothing. She walked to the door, opened it, and before closing it behind her, she said, "Good night, ma'am." Meredith remained still for a long time after the lock had turned. She had questioned 4 people in 24 hours, and not one of those 4 had lied to her even once. That was what frightened her most. In this house, no one needed to lie. They only needed to remain silent, and that silence was arranged so carefully that it told her exactly what it wanted her to hear. The next morning, the lock turned and the door opened without a knock. Bernadette stood in the hallway with her hands clasped in front of her, as though nothing had happened between them the day before. Mr. Rain would like you to come downstairs. Meredith followed her down the stairs, and this time she didn't count the doors because she'd already counted them all. Bernadette led her into a long corridor in the south wing, then stopped at the entrance and went no farther. He's waiting for you at the end. The corridor was about 40 paces long, with windows overlooking the sea on one side and paintings hanging along the other. Meredith stepped into it and walked very slowly, not because of the paintings, but because instinct told her to. She wanted to know where she was walking before she arrived there. They were all portraits. A man in a black suit from the previous century, another man standing beside a leather-upholstered chair, a married couple, a younger man with a pocket watch resting in his palm, 8 generations, perhaps more, arranged in a straight line according to some order only the people of this house would know how to read, and not one of them had a nameplate, not a single small brass plaque beneath a frame, not one line of writing, not one year. Meredith had walked 3/4 of the way down the corridor when she stopped. One portrait hung with more space around it than the others. A silver-haired woman sat at a slight angle, both hands folded one over the other in her lap, and the artist had painted those hands with greater care than the face itself. Meredith stared at it, and something stirred very deep in her memory, the feeling of being able to name something without being able to summon the name, like catching a scent from childhood. She had seen this face before. She didn't know where. She tilted her head, searching for the particular line or feature that had awakened that faint recognition. And she couldn't find it, because the woman in the portrait was healthy, her hair neatly arranged, her back straight, and whatever Meredith had seen before hadn't looked anything like this. You found her faster than I expected. August Rain stood at the far end of the corridor, and once again Meredith hadn't heard him arrive. He didn't come closer. He simply stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, watching her. Not the portrait. Her. Who is she? Meredith asked. He didn't answer. None of these portraits has a name, she continued. An entire corridor full of portraits, and no one has a name. You don't find that strange? In my house, we don't need nameplates. The people here know who they are. Then tell me her name. August remained silent. He was studying her, and he did it in a way 7 years in nursing had taught Meredith to recognize immediately. The way a doctor watched a patient while waiting for medication to take effect, waiting for a reaction, waiting to see how the body would answer. He was waiting for her to remember something, and when she didn't, something very faint passed across his face and disappeared, and Meredith couldn't tell whether it was disappointment or relief. "Have you eaten?" he asked. "You just asked me whether I've eaten. Bernadette says you've skipped 3 meals. You lock me inside a room with the door bolted, the windows covered in safety film, and someone patrolling outside all night, and you're worried about what I eat. I'm concerned about a great many things when it comes to you, Miss Holland. You already know that." Meredith stepped away from the portrait and walked straight toward him, stopping 2 steps away, closer than she'd intended. "Then I'll ask you one question, and you give me an honest answer. Why marriage?" He lifted his chin slightly. "You already have me," she said. "The doors are locked, the windows are covered in film, and there are people patrolling outside all night. You don't need a piece of paper. Why have a ceremony? Why have a judge? Why put on this whole performance? Why not just keep me locked up?" Only the sound of the sea remained in the corridor. "A man in my position needs a wife," August Rain said. "Not a prisoner." He said it as calmly as though he were reading a line from a ledger. "I already have other places for prisoners." Meredith felt the words pass through her, and she understood that he wasn't threatening her. He was simply answering her question completely, and it was that completeness that made cold move through her body. She stepped back half a pace, and behind her, in the middle of the corridor, the silver-haired woman still sat with her hands folded one over the other, nameless, waiting. He led her out of the corridor, through 2 turns, and into a corner room with a desk and a large window looking straight out over the sea, and 2 place settings had already been arranged on the table. Meredith didn't sit down. "You can stand through the entire meal if you want," August said, pulling out his own chair. "But you haven't eaten properly in 3 days, and people who starve themselves don't negotiate well." The words struck a place inside her she hadn't expected. For 7 years, she'd said almost the same thing to patients' families in hospital hallways at 4 o'clock in the morning, that they had to eat, they had to sleep, because exhausted people couldn't help anyone. She sat down. She ate 3 bites, no more. And during those 3 bites, she looked through the window and counted 2 men crossing the lawn in opposite directions. "I want to call my brother," she said. August set down his knife. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out a thin envelope, and slid it across the table toward her. Meredith looked at the envelope for 2 seconds before picking it up. Inside was a photograph. Danny was wafting down the steps of the college library, his backpack hanging from one shoulder, a paper cup in his other hand. He was laughing. He had turned to the left, saying something to someone outside the frame, his mouth open in the middle of a sentence, the kind of laugh people had when they were telling a friend something funny while walking. His coat was new. He'd had his hair cut. He looked taller than the last time she'd seen him. Meredith held the photograph and waited for fear to come. But fear didn't come in the way she'd prepared herself for, because there was nothing in that photograph. No one standing behind him, no car parked at the curb, no hand resting on his shoulder. Just a 19-year-old college student walking down the library steps on a beautiful morning, laughing with a friend. He looked healthy. He looked busy. He looked completely fine. And that was exactly what sent cold pouring down Meredith's spine, because she was his sister. Because for 14 months, she hadn't called him on her worst nights, so he wouldn't hear it in her voice. And she'd counted every dollar so he wouldn't have to leave school. And she'd sat at the kitchen table at 2 o'clock in the morning, adding and adding numbers that were never enough. Meanwhile, somewhere 2 hours away from her, her brother was getting a new haircut and laughing in the middle of a story. Someone had been taking better care of him than she had. "Taken yesterday," August said. "What do you want?" Meredith asked. Her voice was very quiet. "You want me to understand that you can reach him. Fine. I understand. You want me sitting here imagining what happens if I don't do what you say? No." He took the photograph from her hand, very gently, and placed it face up on the table between them. "If I wanted you thinking that way, I would have chosen a different photograph. There are others." Meredith looked up. "His tuition for 4 years has been paid in full," August Rain said. "All of it. Not this semester, not this year. 4 years. Room and board and books included." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "He doesn't owe anyone a cent. He won't have to leave school in September, and he won't have to work night shifts at a warehouse to keep his place." He paused. "Did you know he'd applied for a job at the warehouse, Miss Holland?" Meredith hadn't known. "And there's one more thing." August turned the photograph slightly on the table, aligning it neatly with the edge, a small, precise movement. The investigation into your license. I can make it disappear. He said it and stopped there. He didn't add another word. Meredith sat motionless. For 14 months she'd lived with a scale inside her chest. Danny on one side and everything else on the other. And she'd always known exactly what she would throw away if she were ever forced to choose. But the man sitting across from her hadn't put anything on that scale at all. He wasn't threatening to take something away. He had already given. He'd given before she even knew she was being given anything. And she sat there, looking at her brother's smile in a photograph taken yesterday, and understood that what would bind her to this house wouldn't be the lock on the second-floor door. "You want me to thank you," she said. "No," August Rain said. "I only want you to know. You should know everything before you decide anything." He picked up his knife and continued eating, and Meredith Holland sat across from him with her hands resting in her lap. And for the first time since she'd awakened on that train, she no longer knew what she was supposed to be afraid of. Meredith placed her hand on the table and did what 7 years of standing between doctors' and patients' families had taught her to do. She stopped arguing and began negotiating. "If I do what you want tomorrow," she said, "then I want 3 things." August Rain set down his knife. "Go on. First, my door isn't locked anymore. I can move freely through the house and the garden, without anyone following behind me." "Agreed," he answered so quickly that she lost her rhythm for a beat. "Inside the inner fence. Beyond that, no. And not because I'm keeping you here, but because Emmett won't allow it, and he doesn't work for you." "Second," she drew in a breath. "One phone call. Just one. I need to hear my brother's voice." And at that, August Rain shook his head. Meredith went rigid. She'd prepared herself to be refused on the third condition. She'd arranged every argument she had to hold on to the third at any cost, and give up the first if necessary. But she hadn't prepared herself to be refused here. "You won't let me call him. I don't agree with the number," he said. "One phone call is what people give prisoners, Miss Holland. Not one call. You can call whenever you want, anyone you want, and I won't be in the room when you do." He took a phone from the desk drawer and slid it across the table toward her. "This is yours. Your number is still the same." Meredith stared at the phone lying between them and didn't reach for it. Something inside her chest shifted and lost its grip. She had entered this negotiation with something to trade and a price she thought was too high to ask, and the man sitting across from her had just offered more than she'd asked for, without demanding anything in exchange. In 7 years of nursing, she'd never met anyone who negotiated that way. People bargained to hold something back. This man bargained by giving more. "The third thing," he reminded her. Meredith looked up and said it plainly, because if she tried to soften the words, she knew she wouldn't get them out. "You don't touch me. Not tomorrow. Not afterward. Never. Unless I agree." There was a silence, and in that silence Meredith saw something she would think about for a very long time. August Rain's face didn't darken with anger. It went pale, only slightly, around the corners of his mouth. The kind of pallor that came over someone who had been struck in a place they hadn't even raised a hand to protect. "You think I'm that kind of man," he said. "I don't know what kind of man you are. You've been in my house for 3 days, and you think I would do that. You put me on a train while I was asleep." Meredith heard her own voice trembling, and didn't care. "You locked my bedroom door for 2 nights. You know which side my ribs were broken on. You tell me, what am I supposed to think about you?" August Rain stood. He walked to the window and remained there with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, and he stayed that way longer than Meredith found comfortable. When he turned back, his face had returned to normal, but his voice hadn't completely. "I won't touch you until you ask me to." "I'll never ask." "Then I'll never touch you," he said, "and you'll never have to bring this up again. This is the last time we speak about it." He walked toward the door. "Make your call. I'll step outside." The door closed. Meredith sat alone in the corner room, with the sound of the sea beyond the window and the phone lying in the middle of the table. She picked it up. Her hand was shaking so badly that she had to enter the number twice before she got it right. It rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Meredith rose from the chair without realizing she'd done it. 4 rings. 5. Then voicemail, and Danny's voice. The recording he'd made back when he was still in high school, cheerful and stumbling slightly over the last word. She hung up. She called again immediately. 5 rings. Voicemail. She called a 3rd time, and this time she let it ring all the way through, standing in the middle of the room with the phone pressed to her ear, staring out at the sea. No one answered. Over the next 6 days, Meredith called 4 more times. She called in the morning. She called at 7 o'clock in the evening when she knew he usually ate. She called at night. She sent 3 short messages, and not one of them was read. She called Nell Osgood, and Nell didn't answer either. And during those 6 days, Meredith moved freely through the house, went into the garden, walked all the way down to the inner fence, and no one followed even a single step behind her. Her bedroom door wasn't locked for a single night, exactly as he'd promised. She had everything she'd asked for, and more, and she still couldn't hear her brother's voice. On the 7th morning, Paloma came to the room at 9 o'clock without a breakfast tray. She simply stood in the doorway and said, 4 o'clock this afternoon, ma'am. In the West Wing chapel, Meredith called Danny one more time before going downstairs. 5 rings. Voicemail. She set the phone on the table beside the cloth-bound book and the photograph in its new wooden frame, and she stood looking at those 3 things lying side by side for a long moment before she left. The chapel was smaller than she'd imagined, barely large enough for 4 rows of pews, with a low ceiling and light coming through a single stained glass window at the far end. 8 people were already seated. Meredith didn't know any of them, and no one introduced themselves. Emmett Doyle stood at the back beside the door, his hands in his coat pockets, in exactly the same posture she'd seen at Kingston Station. Bernadette sat in the 2nd row. The man standing before the altar looked nearly 70, with white hair and a thin folder in his hands, and he nodded to August like 2 men who had met 1,000 times before. Judge Harold Kessner. August met her at the end of the aisle. This time he didn't offer his hand. He simply took a small, worn velvet box from the inside pocket of his coat, opened it, and held it out to her. Inside was a silver brooch shaped like an olive branch, with no gemstones, no elaborate ornamentation, only silver darkened gently with age, and a line of leaves crafted with remarkable care. My grandmother wore it on her wedding day, he said. Then my mother. Meredith looked at the brooch, and hated the feeling that stirred inside her chest, because it was beautiful, and beautiful, in exactly the way she would have chosen for herself, if her life had ever given her enough money to choose. Nothing showy, nothing loudly expensive, just something that had been worn by the women who came before. I don't want to take it. You don't have to keep it, August said, only for today. She took it. She pinned it to her left lapel, with 2 fingers accustomed to small, precise tasks, and she didn't turn it over to look at the back. She had no reason to. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes. Judge Kessner read in the steady voice of a man who had spoken these words many times before. Words about sharing a life, about carrying burdens, about good days and days that weren't good, and Meredith heard them pass through her without finding anything to hold on to. Then it was her turn. She opened her mouth and heard her own voice carrying through the little chapel. Clear, certain, steadier than she'd believed she could manage, and she understood why. 7 years of telling patients' families the hardest things they would ever hear in hospital hallways at 4 o'clock in the morning had taught her one thing, that the voice was the last thing allowed to fall apart. Your hands could shake. Your voice couldn't. Kessner closed the folder. August turned toward her. He didn't hurry. He raised one hand, stopped halfway, and waited. And that pause lasted exactly long enough for her to step back if she wanted to. She didn't. His hand touched one side of her face, and he kissed her. Not briefly. Not the formal kiss of a ceremony performed in front of 8 strangers. And Meredith Holland, who had held the hands of 423 people during the final hours of their lives, who had supported people's heads while they vomited, wiped their faces when they cried, held their shoulders when they couldn't hold themselves together, stood there in that small chapel and realized that she didn't know this feeling. For 7 years, she had touched hundreds of people, and every touch had been something she gave. And everyone who had ever touched her had taken something away. Colin had taken money, taken her confidence, taken even her good name. Her father, without meaning to, had taken 7 years. She returned the kiss for 2 seconds. 2 seconds, no more. Then she stepped back, her face burning, and she hated herself so fiercely that she had to clench both hands to keep them from shaking. That evening, August found her on the back porch. There's something I'd like to ask you to do, he said. Meredith didn't turn around. Rosalind Whitmore, 61 years old, the wife of Charles Whitmore, a man I've done business with for 20 years. She's in the final stage of her illness, and she refuses to go to the hospital. She says she won't die in a room that smells like bleach. He paused. She needs a nurse. I want that nurse to be you. Meredith stood still for a very long time. She understood immediately what he was doing. Over the past 6 days, he had given her back the unlocked door, the garden, the phone. Now he was giving back the last thing. The thing Colin Vance had taken from her and the court hadn't returned. The thing she was. He was building her a full, complete, decent life inside his fence. And that was a cage more intricate than any lock. What time? She asked. What? What time do I start tomorrow? Meredith said, because Rosalind was a real patient, and she was a nurse. The Whitmore house was 20 minutes away by car, and Emmett drove her there at 9 o'clock in the morning without saying a single word the entire way. The person who opened the door led her upstairs, to the end of a hallway, and pointed toward a door standing slightly ajar. Meredith stopped outside it for exactly 3 seconds, the pause she'd made thousands of times before thousands of hospital room doors, long enough to settle her face back into place. Then she knocked twice and stepped inside. The woman lying in the bed turned her head. She was thin, her silver hair cut short, and she lay tilted slightly onto her right side in the way of someone who had found the only position that was still comfortable. On the bedside table sat a glass of water with a bent straw, a small bell, and nothing else. Meredith read the room in 4 seconds and knew everything she needed to know. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm Meredith." The woman looked at her. She looked for a long time, from head to toe, and Meredith let her. "Charles told me the Rain household was sending someone over," Rosalind Whitmore said. Her voice was rough but clear. "He said it was young August's wife." "Yes, then go home." Meredith didn't move. "I don't need some young wife coming here to sit and hold my hand so she can earn points with her husband," Rosalind said. "I've endured people like that for 32 years. I don't intend to spend my last few weeks with them." Meredith set her bag down on the chair. She walked around the foot of the bed to the right side, and she did 3 things without thinking about them first. She tilted the water glass to see how much was left. She lowered her eyes to the woman's feet beneath the blanket and checked the swelling around her ankles. Then she pulled the chair away from its old position, placed it at an angle on the right side of the bed, and sat down. "You lie on your right side," Meredith said. "That means turning left hurts. People put the chair on the left because there's more room there. And for the past week, you've had to turn your neck every time someone spoke to you. Starting today, I'll sit on this side." The room went quiet for a moment. Rosalind Whitmore looked at her, and something in the woman's eyes changed. "You're a nurse." "Yes, a real nurse. 7 years at St. Brendan, 4th floor." The woman in the bed was silent for a long time. Then she said, "How many people have you stayed with until the very end?" Meredith didn't answer immediately. No patient had ever asked her that question. Families asked. Young doctors asked. Patients didn't, because patients understood what the answer would be used for. 423, Meredith said. Rosalind nodded very slowly. "Then you can look at me and know how much time I have left." "Mrs. Whitmore." "Don't call me Mrs. Whitmore. You know. Tell me, have you asked your doctor?" "I did. He talked to me about options. He talked about quality of life. He talked for 15 minutes, and I didn't understand a single word of it." Her hand tightened around the edge of the blanket. "Charles tells me not to think about it. My daughter in Boston calls every night and cries. Not one person in this house will say one true thing to me. I've been lying here for 4 weeks, and I don't know how many days I'm supposed to be planning for." Meredith looked at those hands. She looked at the color of the skin across the backs of them, the way Rosalind was breathing, the nearly untouched glass of water, the swelling around her ankles, and she did the calculations 7 years had taught her to make without paper or pencil. Then she looked up and told the truth, because that was the only thing this woman was asking of her. "About 7 weeks, Meredith said. "Maybe 8, not more." Rosalind Whitmore closed her eyes. She lay still that way for a long time, and Meredith didn't say anything else, didn't apologize, didn't offer the comforting filler people so often used, because she'd learned long ago that those words were usually meant to make the speaker feel better. When Rosalind opened her eyes again, there was water in them, but she wasn't crying. "Thank you," she said. Then she continued, "I can plan for 7 weeks. For the past 4 weeks I haven't been able to plan anything because I didn't know what I was planning for." Meredith poured water into the glass and adjusted the straw. "Now it's my turn," Rosalind said. "What?" "You sit there and tell me the truth. I'll give you one truth in return." She turned her head, and this time she looked directly into Meredith's eyes. "You aren't August Rain's wife." Meredith sat very still. "I've seen that look in the mirror for 32 years. Rosalind Whitmore said very softly. "You count doors when you enter a room. You sit where you can see the exit. You're wearing his mother's brooch, and you don't even know what it is you're wearing." She exhaled. "You've sat with 423 people, Meredith. Don't lie to number 424. That evening, August had the table set on the back porch, the place that looked straight out over the sea, and when Meredith stepped outside, he was already sitting there. She took the seat across from him and didn't wait for him to speak first. For the past 7 days, she'd been answering other people's questions. Tonight, she'd come to ask her own. "Mrs. Whitmore knows I'm not your wife," she said. She knew within 10 minutes. August poured water. "Rosalind is the smartest person in that house, and Charles has never realized it. You're not worried?" "No. You sent me into the home of someone who knows exactly what's happening, and you're not worried." She won't tell anyone, August said. She doesn't have time left to go telling anyone. And she isn't the kind of person who would. Meredith placed her hand on the table. Do you know how long she has? No. 7 weeks. She looked directly at him. I told her this morning. It was the first time anyone had told her the truth in 4 weeks. August didn't answer. He only looked at her, and Meredith realized she was searching for something on his face. And this time she found it. Something very slight. Not pity. Something closer to recognition. Mr. Rain, she said. I want to ask you something. Ask. The scar along your jaw. The hand holding his water glass stopped. It didn't jerk or tremble. It simply stopped. And Meredith saw it because 7 years had taught her to watch the places people didn't have time to hide. I'm asking because this is what I do, she continued. It was stitched badly. Whoever did it was in a hurry, or didn't have enough light, or both. It wasn't stitched in a hospital. Only the sound of the waves remained on the porch. August Rain set the glass down. He looked out at the sea, and he sat that way for so long that Meredith began to think he wasn't going to answer, that she'd gone too far, and some door had just closed forever. Then he spoke. 24 years old. He didn't turn back. The night I took this seat, someone disagreed, and he stopped there. Not another word. No name, no place, no explanation of what had happened afterward to the person who had disagreed. Meredith waited, but the next sentence never came, and she understood that it never would. She'd met that kind of silence before. Older men on the 4th floor, men who'd once been soldiers, spoke the same way. One short sentence and then nothing. And that one sentence always carried far more than the words inside it. The waiter cleared the plates and brought another course. Waves struck the rocks below. Meredith picked up her fork and didn't know what she was supposed to say. Then August Rain said one more thing, and no one had asked him for it. My mother used to read aloud to other people. Meredith looked up. He was still staring at the sea. She said silence made people die faster. And then he said nothing else. Not another word for the rest of the meal. He ate slowly, steadily, looking out over the water. And when the table was cleared, he stood, gave her a single nod, and went back into the house. Meredith remained alone on the porch for a long time. She had come to that table looking for an opening, and she'd found one. In 8 days inside this house, that man had never said anything he hadn't calculated beforehand. He didn't lie, didn't evade, didn't misspeak. Every sentence was placed exactly where he wanted it, like a piece on a chessboard. But that last sentence hadn't been. That sentence had slipped out of him. There it was. The crack. Meredith stood, went inside, climbed the stairs, and returned to her room. She closed the door no one locked anymore, and stood in the middle of the room looking at the 3 things resting on the small table beside the bed. The phone no one had called back, the photograph of her father in its new wooden frame, and the faded blue cloth-bound book. The book she'd read aloud for 6 weeks to a woman who never had a single visitor. She looked at it. She picked it up and turned to page 143. As she'd done a dozen times over the past 8 days, and she still didn't understand why it was here. Something was lying very close to her, right beside her, only 1 step away. She stood there with the book in her hands, and she couldn't take that step. Meredith set it down, turned off the light, and lay in the darkness, and it wasn't until nearly dawn that she finally fell asleep. 3 weeks passed. Meredith went to the Whitmore house every morning and returned every afternoon, and during those 3 weeks, she watched something she'd already watched 423 times before, the way a person slowly withdrew from the world, little by little, without noise. Rosalind stopped eating lunch first. Then she stopped sitting up in the mornings. By the 3rd week, she spoke more slowly, pausing in the middle of sentences to catch her breath, and her hand trembled when she lifted her glass, so Meredith steadied it without asking. On Thursday morning of that week, Rosalind told her to open the curtains all the way. I want to see outside, she said. Charles keeps having them closed because he's afraid I'll get cold. He's afraid of everything, except the things worth being afraid of. Meredith opened the curtains and sat down in the chair on the right side of the bed. Her place. Meredith. Yes, 32 years ago, I sang in a church choir in Hartford. She said it while looking out the window. I was 29. I taught music at an elementary school, and I sang on Wednesday nights. Charles Whitmore sat in the 4th row one night in October. I didn't know he was there. I didn't know who he was. She took a short breath. 4 days later, I was in his house. Meredith sat still. I ran away 5 times, Rosalind said. The first time I made it 4 hours. The second time, a day and a half. The third time I was smarter. I saved money for 3 months and made it all the way to Albany. She paused longer. The 5th time, I reached Chicago. A bird called outside the window. I sat in the Chicago train station for 4 hours, she said. I had money in my pocket. I had my papers. No one was chasing me. Do you understand? No one at all. I'd made it out. I sat on that wooden bench looking at the departure board, and I watched one train after another. Her voice grew rougher. Then I realized I didn't know where I was going. I had no one to go to. I was 30 years old, and I didn't have a single friend left whom he hadn't already called. I'd taught music, but I hadn't taught in 7 years, and no one remembered my name anymore. She turned her head and looked at Meredith. I took the train back. I took it myself. No one forced me. That's the part I still haven't forgiven myself for. Meredith sat very still. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't find a single sentence that didn't sound hollow. Don't adapt, Rosalind said. Her voice suddenly grew firmer. Listen to me carefully. Don't adapt. I adapted, and I got so good at it that 32 years later I'm still adapting. And only now do I understand that it was a slow kind of dying, not a life. Then what am I supposed to do? But don't waste your strength on the walls either, she continued. I wasted it 5 times. Doors, gates, trains, money. None of it mattered. That house has 20 people working in it, and the walls are high, and you're alone. She paused to breathe. You have to do something else. You have to find the thing he's afraid of losing. Meredith frowned. He's not afraid of losing anything. He has everything. Everyone is afraid of losing one thing, Meredith. Charles is afraid of losing the way people look at him in a boardroom. That's the one thing I ever managed to take from him in my whole life, and I took it because I knew where it lived. She looked at her. Young August Rain isn't keeping you because you're beautiful. He can buy beauty. He's keeping you for a reason, and that reason is where he's weak. Find it, and you'll have something to stand on. I don't know what that reason is. Then find out. Rosalind closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. And I'll ask about something for you. You're sick. You shouldn't. I'm sick. I'm not dead, she said. There's a driver here named Wallace. He's been driving me for 26 years, and he writes everything down. Every trip, every appointment, even Charles's appointments. Men in this house never think about whether the driver can read. She let out a slow breath. I'll ask him to go back through last year, starting in January. Look for what? I don't know yet, Rosalind said. But if young August arranged your life that carefully, he had to leave traces somewhere. You can't rearrange an entire person's life without meeting anyone. That afternoon, Meredith returned to Rosewater House and went upstairs to her room, and she sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time in the fading light, thinking about a woman who had sat for 4 hours on a wooden bench in a Chicago train station 32 years earlier. That night, after she'd turned off the light, she lay there listening. She heard someone's footsteps move down the hallway, pause for one beat outside her door, then continue on. And for the first time in 21 nights, there was no sound of the lock turning. The phone vibrated at 7:10 that evening, and Meredith was sitting on the edge of the bed, taking off her shoes after a day at the Whitmore house. She looked at the screen, and for 1 second she didn't believe what she was seeing. Danny, she answered before the second ring. Danny, Mary. His voice came through perfectly clear, and there was noise behind him. Voices, dishes, the sound of a crowded cafeteria at dinner time. You called me a bunch of times, didn't you? I'm sorry. I dropped my old phone in the lake when we went kayaking, and I only got my old number back this morning. Meredith shot to her feet. She'd been preparing for this call for 6 days. She'd arranged every sentence in order. Short, clear, without a single unnecessary word. Exactly the way she used to hand off a patient between shifts. Danny, listen to me. Don't say anything yet. Just listen. I'm not in Providence. I'm in Newport, in a house that isn't mine, and I didn't come here because I wanted to. There's a man named August Rain. August? Meredith stood motionless in the middle of the room. What? August, Danny said. You've met him already? Oh, right. Of course. He probably told you about the scholarship fund. I was going to wait until summer to tell you. I wanted to tell you in person. There was a silence, and Meredith could hear someone laughing somewhere behind her brother. Danny, what did you just say? The fund? He said, still cheerful, still sounding like someone sharing good news. Back in January, the school sent me a letter saying I'd been selected for a full scholarship. I thought it was a mistake. I even went to the financial aid office twice to make sure. Tuition, room and board, even books. Mary, 4 years. I don't have to work at the warehouse anymore. What's the fund called? What? What is the name of the fund, Danny? The Margaret Behan Fund, he said. I looked it up online, but there isn't much about it. I think it's private. Meredith sat down on the edge of the bed. She sat because her legs could no longer hold her. Behan, 6 weeks, bed 8. Mrs. Behan. You've met him? She heard herself ask, and her voice sounded perfectly calm, and she couldn't understand how it could possibly sound that calm. Twice, Danny said. He came up to campus in March and took me to lunch at that place near the library, then again last month. He asked me a lot about you. He laughed. A ridiculous amount. What you liked when you were little, where you went to school, why you became a nurse, how you took care of Dad when he got sick. I sat there and told him everything for an hour and a half. I even told him how you gave up the advanced program so you could stay home with Dad. Meredith closed her eyes. He really listened, Mary. No one's ever listened to me like that before. Then Danny's voice changed slightly. The way someone's voice changed when they realized the person on the other end of the line had been silent too long. Mary, did I do something wrong? Meredith opened her eyes and looked toward the window, into the darkness outside where a light was moving slowly along its usual route beside the inner fence. For 6 days, she'd lived on one thought alone, that if she could only hear her brother's voice, then she'd have someone outside. Someone who knew, a thread connecting her to the life she'd had before, and now she could hear that voice. It was healthy. It was happy. It had just told her that for the past 4 months, her brother had been sitting down to lunch with that man and telling him the story of her entire life, and he'd done it with gratitude, and he'd been waiting until summer so he could tell his sister the good news face to face. No one had threatened her brother. No one had touched a hair on his head. They had simply treated him better than she'd ever been able to, and in doing so they had taken him out of her hands, neatly, kindly, without leaving a single scratch. What would happen if she told him the truth now? He would believe her. He would leave school in the middle of the semester. He would take a bus to Newport at midnight with $300 in his pocket. And he would stand in front of that gate, 19 years old and alone. Meredith thought of that gate, thought of Emmett Doyle standing on the other side. Mary? No, she said. Her voice was very steady. You didn't do anything wrong. You sound strange. Are you okay? I'm fine. I'm just tired. I had a long shift today. What about what you were saying before? You said you were in Newport. I took a private nursing case here, Meredith said. An older woman. It pays well. She heard herself lie to her brother for the first time in 19 years, and felt something inside her chest crack very softly. Study hard, Danny. I will. Take care of yourself. I love you. She ended the call. Then Meredith Holland stood up and remained motionless in that room for a very long time, still holding the phone after the screen had gone dark, and only 2 words remained in her mind, the 2 words she'd just heard from her brother's mouth. Margaret Behan. Meredith found him in the study at the corner of the house. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open, stood in the middle of the room, and said the 2 words, Margaret Behan. August Rain was sitting at his desk. He set down his pen. He didn't ask where she'd heard the name, didn't ask what Danny had said, didn't spend even a second calculating how he should answer. He simply stood. You're not going to deny it. No. The fund paying my brother's tuition carries that name. Yes. Tell me who she was. August walked to the door. Come with me. He led her upstairs, past the 2nd floor, then up another staircase, narrower than the others, one she'd never taken before. The 3rd floor was dark, the hallway short, with only 4 doors. He stopped at the last one, took a key from the inside pocket of his coat, and fitted it into the lock. The lock was stiff. He had to turn it twice. The door opened, and the smell inside struck Meredith before she could see anything. Not dust. The smell of a sick room that had been closed for a very long time. A smell she knew better than the smell of her own home. August switched on the light. A hospital bed. An IV pole with the bag removed. An oxygen concentrator pushed into the corner, its tubing coiled neatly. A chair placed on the right side of the bed at an angle. The exact angle people only used when they knew which side a patient lay on. On the bedside table sat a glass, a small bell, and a book. A faded blue cloth cover. Meredith stepped forward. She didn't remember moving. She picked up the book, and it fell open by itself to page 143, where a thin ribbon lay between the pages, and she stood there staring at the paper while, in her ears, she heard her own voice reading aloud in another room 11 months earlier. At 2 o'clock in the morning, to a woman who had no visitors. The other copy belongs to the hospital, August said behind her. I bought an identical one, same year of publication. It took me 4 months to find it. Meredith lifted a hand to the left lapel of her coat. The silver olive branch brooch was still there. She had worn it every day since the wedding without once thinking to take it off. She unfastened it. She turned it over. 2 tiny engraved letters, worn smooth by years. M and B. Margaret Behan, Meredith said. Her voice sounded like someone else's. That was my mother's maiden name, August said. She was admitted under it. We couldn't let anyone know where she was. In my line of work, there are people who will wait a very long time for a weakness like that to show. Meredith turned around. Bed 8. Yes. 6 weeks. 6 weeks and 4 days. September 19th, she said. 4:12 in the morning. August Rain stood in the middle of his mother's room and said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke. And for the first time in 34 days, his voice lost that steady rhythm. I was in Boston. There was something I couldn't leave. They called me at 3:15, and I drove the entire way, and I got there at 4:52. He stopped. I was 40 minutes too late. He looked at her. You were there in my place. And Meredith Holland cried. She hadn't cried on the train. She hadn't cried when she'd heard the lock turn, hadn't cried in the chapel, hadn't cried when she'd listened to her brother cheerfully tell her about those lunches. But she cried now, standing in this room with the book in one hand and the brooch in the other, because she'd just understood something that shattered everything she'd believed about the past 34 days. This man hadn't bought her. He didn't covet her, didn't collect her, didn't choose her the way a man chose an object. He owed her. He owed her the one thing, his money, his power, everything he possessed, hadn't been able to buy on the most important night of his life. And he'd spent 11 months trying to find a way to repay it. And the way he'd chosen to repay her was by locking his creditor inside a beautiful house. You don't get to do that to people, she said through her tears. You don't get to. August didn't come closer. He reached inside his coat, took out a thin file, and placed it on the bedside table beside the glass and the little bell. This is yours. Meredith didn't pick it up. Rhode Island Medical Board, he said. The investigation has been closed. Your nursing license has been fully reinstated, with no notation and no restrictions. It was signed 3 weeks ago. She looked up. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, August Rain said. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd ask what I wanted in return. He stepped back toward the door. This isn't a condition, Miss Holland. This is something you should have had from the beginning. The next morning, Meredith went to the Whitmore house, and she knew the moment she reached the doorway that the night had been a bad one. Rosalind was propped higher in the bed, her breathing shallow, and the hand resting on top of the blanket was no longer gripping its edge. Meredith pulled the chair to the right side of the bed. Did you get any sleep? Not much. Rosalind shifted her eyes toward her. Bottom drawer, left side. Meredith opened the drawer and took out a stack of papers held together with a metal clip. Photocopied pages of handwriting, small and even, with dates written in a vertical column down the left side. Wallace brought them over Tuesday night, Rosalind said. She tried to lift one hand, but it rose barely the width of a knuckle above the blanket before falling back down. I meant to look through them myself first. You read. Meredith pulled the chair closer and opened the stack across her lap. It was a driver's trip log. 1 trip per line, date, departure time, return time, destination, and the names of everyone present. 26 years recorded that way. Wallace had photocopied everything beginning in January of the previous year. Meredith read slowly, following each line, while another timeline sat inside her head, one she knew by heart better than almost anything in the world. March 20th, Colin filed the report. April 11th, she went to the District 4 police station. June, she lost the apartment. She turned to March and stopped. March 1st, a trip from the Whitmore house to an address on Angel Street in Providence. Present, Charles Whitmore and August Rain. Wallace's note in the margin, written smaller, 210, waited outside in the car. Meredith knew the Angel Street address. It was the office of the law firm St. Brendan Hospital regularly used. She kept reading. March 4th, the same address, 1 hour and 40 minutes. March 9th, another address in Pawtucket. Note, private meeting, 40 minutes. March 14th, back to Angel Street. Meredith sat very still for a long time with the papers in her lap. She counted again. She counted twice, because she didn't believe it the first time. From March 1st to March 20th was 19 days. 19 days before Colin Vance filed the report with her name in it. That man had already been sitting in the hospital attorney's office. He'd sat there 4 times. He'd known. Meredith. She didn't answer. She was staring down at that column of dates, and something very cold was rising inside her chest. Slowly, steadily, like water filling a cellar. He had known. He knew Colin was setting her up. Knew 19 days beforehand. Knew enough to spend 4 meetings with the hospital's lawyers. With everything that man had at his disposal, it would have taken 1 phone call. 1. That report would have never been filed. The board would have never met. She would still have been working the night shift on the 4th floor of St. Brendan that morning. Tired, poor, but still belonging to herself. He hadn't called. He had waited. He waited for the board to suspend her license. Waited for her to go to the District 4 police station and sit there giving her statement with both hands shaking. Waited for the case to be closed 9 days later. Waited for her to sell the rest of her belongings give up the apartment, count down to her last $3,400, and board the night train leaving Providence at 7:40 with a suitcase packed in a hurry. Only then did he appear. Meredith closed her eyes, and she could see it so clearly it hurt. That man had never pushed her down. He had never laid a hand on her. He had simply stood there and watched her fall, month by month, gone down ahead of her, and waited at the bottom to catch her at the exact moment she hit the ground. And that was the most terrible part. Because in all 35 days she'd spent in his house, every sentence he'd spoken to her had been true. Every single one. He hadn't lied to her once. He had only chosen when to speak. And that moment had been chosen 19 days before her life collapsed. Meredith. She opened her eyes. Rosalind was looking at her, and now the woman could only speak in short phrases, pausing between them to breathe. You found it, didn't you? Yes. Tell me, Meredith told her. Very simply. 19 days. 4 visits to the lawyer's office. 1 phone call that was never made. Rosalind listened to all of it. Then she closed her eyes and lay so still for so long that Meredith reached for her wrist. I'm all right, Rosalind said without opening her eyes. Listen to me. She stopped to catch her breath. 32 years ago, I went looking for something like that too. I never found it. All I had were walls, and I threw myself against them 5 times. She opened her eyes. They were cloudier than they'd been the week before, but her gaze was still direct. Now you have yours. Meredith returned to Rosewater House at 7 o'clock that evening, and she didn't go upstairs. She walked straight into the study at the corner of the house and placed the stack of photocopied pages neatly on the desk in front of August Rain. She didn't throw them. March 1st, she said. March 4th, March 9th, March 14th. 4 meetings at St. Brendan's law firm on Angel Street. He looked down at the papers. He didn't reach out to touch them. Colin filed the report on March 20th, Meredith said. 19 days after your first meeting. He didn't deny it. She'd known he wouldn't, and that was what allowed her to keep going. You knew, she said. You knew before I did. You sat across from the hospital's lawyers 4 times. And you knew exactly what was about to happen to me. 1 phone call. All you had to do was make 1 call. She heard how calm her own voice sounded, and it surprised her. You didn't call. August Rain rose from his chair. If I had called, he said, you would have stayed in Providence. Yes, you would have stayed in that 3rd-floor apartment on Wickenden Street. You would have kept working night shifts with the man who shoved you into a supply cart, and that report would have been written again, the next month, or the next year, because men like that don't stop. I could stop 1 report. I couldn't stop an entire life. You had no right to decide that for me. No, he said. I didn't. He admitted it so calmly that Meredith had to pause for a beat to regain her momentum. She took 1 step closer. I'll tell you what you did, she said. You paid my father's debt. You paid 4 years of my brother's tuition. You got my nursing license back, and you didn't tell me for 3 weeks because you didn't want me thinking it was a condition. You gave me an unlocked door, gave me the garden, gave me the phone, gave me a patient so I could still be myself. Her voice began to shake, and she let it. You gave me everything, Mr. Rain. Everything except the one thing that mattered most. She looked straight at him. You didn't give me the right to refuse any of it. Only the sound of the sea remained beyond the window. And until you give me that, Meredith said, none of those things are gifts. They're invoices. I wake up every morning in this house owing you more than I did the day before. Do you know what that feels like? It isn't being loved. It's being bought on an installment plan. August Rain's face went pale around the corners of his mouth, the same way it had gone pale once before, the night she'd named her 3rd condition. I've never thought of you as an object. No, she said. You thought of me as a debt. That's worse. She drew in a breath. Then she said the sentence she'd been carrying inside her chest since leaving Rosalind's bedside that afternoon. Mr. Rain, your mother didn't need me because I was good at my job. There were 6 nurses on the 4th floor who were better than I was. She needed me because I stayed that night, for 3 hours after my shift had ended, and no one made me stay. No one paid me. No one knew. I stayed because I chose to stay. Tears ran down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. That's the only part of me you truly owe, and that's the exact part you're taking away. If you keep me here, then I stay because the doors are locked, because of my brother, because of the bills, not because I choose to, and the person you owe will stop existing. He said nothing. He stood there for a very long time, and Meredith saw something on his face she'd never seen in 36 days. A man being defeated by his own reasoning. Then August Rain reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He took out a key and placed it on the desk between them, beside the photocopied pages. The front door, he said. You can leave tomorrow morning. Meredith looked at the key. If you leave, I won't come after you. No one will go to Providence. Your brother keeps the scholarship, and I will never contact him again." He paused. "But you have to walk through that gate yourself, Miss Holland. I won't open it for you." Meredith looked up. "The outer gate uses a code." "You know the code." "I do." "Then you just lied to me for the first time." "No," August Rain said, and his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "If I open the gate for you, then leaving this place becomes one more thing I gave you. And that's the last gift I can't bear to give." Meredith left the room before dawn. She took nothing with her except the suitcase that had followed her onto that night train, and inside it she placed 3 things: the photograph of her father in its new wooden frame, the file bearing the medical board seal, and the faded blue, cloth-bound book. She left the silver olive branch brooch on the bedside table, arranged neatly with the engraved side facing upward. No one stopped her on the stairs. Bernadette Ross stood at the foot of them with her hands clasped in front of her, and she didn't say a word. But when Meredith passed, the woman bowed her head in the same way she had on that first night, and this time Meredith bowed back. Outside, the fog was still thick. The gravel road stretched about a quarter of a mile from the front steps to the main gate, and Meredith walked the whole distance alone, listening to the suitcase wheels crunch behind her, and she didn't look back once. The outer gate was closed. She stood in front of it with the key in her hand, and she'd known this already, but she tried anyway, and the lock on that gate wasn't the kind that took a key. A small keypad was mounted on the stone pillar, its red light blinking steadily. Meredith stood there, holding the useless key, while the morning fog settled into her hair. Then a wooden door opened at the guardhouse to the right. Emmett Doyle stepped out. He didn't ask where she was going. He didn't speak into a radio. He walked straight to the gate, inserted a key into a mechanical lock set low near the base of the pillar, a lock Meredith had never noticed, and turned it by hand. The heavy gate groaned and opened a few inches. "Mr. Doyle." He didn't look at her. He looked toward the road beyond the gate. "I drove Mrs. Behan to St. Brendan every Tuesday for 6 weeks, Emmett Doyle said. "I parked in the north lot and sat in the car until she was finished. Some nights I sat there until 4 o'clock in the morning." He placed one hand on the gate and pulled it wider. "I knew who you were from the night you arrived, Miss Holland. I saw you on the platform at Kingston. And I knew." Meredith stood still. "She wouldn't have wanted you to stay here," he said. Then he stepped back and stood straight with his arms at his sides, the posture of a man who had stood that way his entire life. Meredith stepped through the gate. She walked about 20 paces before stopping, and she turned around, and on the 3rd floor of the gray stone house behind her, there was exactly one illuminated window. She didn't know whether he was standing there. She would never know. She turned away and kept walking. The road ahead was empty and covered in fog, and in her pocket she had $3,400 and some change, and a newly restored nursing license. And standing in the middle of that road, Meredith Holland understood what Rosalind Whitmore had understood after sitting for 4 hours on a wooden bench in a Chicago train station, that the most frightening cage wasn't the one with iron bars, but the one with nothing waiting for you outside it. But Rosalind had been wrong about one thing. That woman had sat in the station all those years ago, with empty hands, no profession, no one who remembered her name. Meredith walked away from this gate with a profession still in her hands, and that was the cruelest part of the entire story, because that man, through the very precision of his own planning, had personally placed into her hands the one thing in the world that could carry her away from him. 7 months later, Meredith Holland worked as a coordinator at a small hospice center on the east side of Providence. 12 beds, 6 employees, an old building with a leaking roof over one corner of the dining room. The pay was lower than the hospital. The shifts were longer. She walked to work and returned each evening to a 1-bedroom apartment, whose rent she paid herself. Danny was still in school, in his 2nd year, and he called his sister every Sunday night. Rosalind Whitmore died one morning in June, 6.5 weeks after the day Meredith had given her that number, and Meredith had made it back in time to sit beside her until the very end, in the chair on the right. One morning in November, the center received an anonymous donation, enough to repair the roof and open 4 additional beds. Inside the envelope was a faded blue cloth-bound book, marked at page 143, and a small note with a single handwritten line. No conditions attached. Meredith held that note for a very long time. Then she accepted the donation, because those 4 beds meant 4 human lives. Afterward, she sat down at her desk, took out the center's letterhead, and wrote a formal thank you letter to the donor according to the standard template, including a stamped receipt stating the exact amount, exactly as she did for every other donor. She signed her name at the bottom. Meredith Holland, nurse, not Meredith Rain. and no longer a gift, but a transaction between two equals. Some cages are built from kindness, and those are the hardest cages to see, because they're made from the very things we truly need. Someone who truly loves us doesn't hand us an entire world while keeping the key in their pocket. They stand back and watch us build our own world, even if that world is much smaller. A debt of kindness should be repaid with gratitude, not with an entire human life. And a person's worth isn't measured by how much they're given, but by what they have the courage to refuse. Some doors close in 7 minutes, and it can take a lifetime to open them again. If Meredith's story has kept you with us until this moment, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day we can continue bringing you more compelling stories to listen to together. How did this story make you feel? Would you walk through that gate, or would you stay? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below, because we truly want to hear what comes from the deepest part of your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.